Welcome, friend, to this peaceful journey through 1,000 years of royal history, where crowns changed hands like autumn leaves, and kingdoms rose and fell with the turning of seasons. Tonight, we'll walk together through the shadowed halls of medieval courts, where power was won through steel and cunning, and lost through betrayal and time itself. Whether you're settling in for the night or simply seeking refuge from the modern world, I'm grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet hours with me exploring the lives of those who wore the weight of nations on their brows. I'd love to know where you're listening from tonight, what corner of the world you call home, and what time the clock shows as you press play. There's something magical about how these ancient stories can bring strangers together across centuries and continents, reminding us that human nature remains beautifully, tragically constant. If this gentle exploration of royal history brings you the peace you're seeking, consider subscribing. We have many more tales waiting to guide you into restful slumber. What I'm about to share with you isn't some sanitized fairy tale about noble knights and perfect princesses. This is the real story of medieval monarchy, where teenage peasants could become queens through wit and determination, where brothers murdered brothers for golden circlets, and where the fate of millions hung on the whims of individuals who were often barely more than children themselves. These weren't distant figures carved in marble. They were flesh and blood people who loved and hated, who made brilliant decisions and catastrophic mistakes, who shaped the world we inhabit today through choices made in candlelit chambers a millennium ago. Tonight, I'll take you inside the hidden world of medieval courts, where every smile masked a potential threat and every alliance could dissolve with the morning mist. You'll meet kings who conquered half the known world before their 25th birthday, and queens who ruled vast empires while their husbands lay dying in distant battlefields. You'll witness the rise of dynasties that lasted centuries, and the fall of kingdoms that crumbled in a single afternoon. By the end of this journey, you'll understand how a handful of families managed to control the destiny of Europe for 1,000 years, and why their stories still echo through our modern world in ways you never imagined. But before we enter those torchlit halls where destiny was forged in fire and blood, let me paint you a picture of the world they inherited and the forces that shaped their extraordinary lives. The year was 476 when the last Roman emperor in the West abdicated his throne, leaving behind a power vacuum that would take centuries to fill. Across the former empire, tribal chieftains and local strongmen carved out territories from the ruins of Roman civilization. What emerged from this chaos wasn't the immediate rise of great kingdoms, but rather a patchwork of competing warlords, each claiming divine right to rule over whatever lands their swords could hold. Into this fractured landscape stepped figures who would define the very concept of medieval kingship. They weren't born to purple robes and golden crowns. Instead, they were warriors, diplomats, and survivors who understood that power in this new world belonged to those bold enough to seize it and clever enough to keep it. These early medieval rulers faced challenges that would crush modern leaders. They governed without standing armies, collected taxes through personal loyalty rather than institutional authority, and maintained order across vast territories using nothing more than the force of their personality and the fear their reputation inspired. Consider Clovis, the Frankish king who united the warring Gallic tribes in the late 5th century. Born into a world where might made right, he transformed himself from a petty chieftain into the founder of a dynasty that would eventually produce Charlemagne himself. Clovis understood something that many of his contemporaries missed. Military conquest was only the beginning of true kingship. The real challenge lay in transforming temporary victory into permanent authority, in convincing people to obey, not just because they feared your sword, but because they believed in your right to rule. His solution was as brilliant as it was pragmatic. Clovis became the first Germanic king to convert to Catholic Christianity, not out of spiritual conviction, but because he recognized that aligning himself with the church would provide the legitimacy his sword alone could never achieve. The bishops who crowned him weren't just performing a ceremony. They were creating a new form of political authority that combined Germanic warrior traditions with Roman administrative expertise and Christian moral authority. This fusion of military, administrative, and religious power became the foundation of medieval kingship. Future rulers would spend centuries refining and perfecting this model, but the basic structure remained remarkably consistent. A king needed three things to maintain his throne: the ability to defend his realm through military force, the institutional capacity to govern his subjects through law and administration, and the spiritual authority that came from divine sanction. The Merovingian dynasty that Clovis founded would rule the Franks for over 2 centuries. But their story illustrates both the potential and the limitations of early medieval monarchy. These kings commanded vast territories and accumulated enormous wealth, but their power remained fundamentally personal rather than institutional. When a strong king died, his kingdom was divided among his sons according to Frankish custom, leading to civil wars and political fragmentation that weakened royal authority for generations. This pattern of royal strength, followed by dynastic collapse and civil war, would repeat itself throughout the early medieval period. The Visigothic kingdom in Spain, the Ostrogothic realm in Italy, and the various Anglo-Saxon kingdoms in Britain all experienced similar cycles of expansion and contraction based on the personal capabilities of individual rulers. What made the difference between dynasties that lasted decades and those that endured for centuries was their ability to develop institutions and traditions that could survive the death of any particular king. The most successful of these early medieval dynasties was undoubtedly the Carolingians, who replaced the declining Merovingians in the 8th century and went on to create the largest European empire since Rome itself. The rise of the Carolingians demonstrates how medieval royal families could transform themselves from regional power brokers into continental superpowers through a combination of military innovation, diplomatic skill, and sheer audacity. Charles Martel, the grandfather of Charlemagne, built his reputation by defeating the Muslim armies that had conquered Spain and were advancing into France. His victory at the Battle of Tours in 732 didn't just save Christian Europe from Islamic conquest. It established the Carolingians as the premier military dynasty in Western Europe and positioned them to challenge the Merovingians for royal authority. But Charles Martel understood that military success alone wouldn't be enough to legitimize his family's claim to the throne. He needed to build a broader coalition of support that could sustain Carolingian power across multiple generations. His strategy was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Charles Martel systematically cultivated relationships with the Catholic Church, granting monasteries and bishoprics extensive lands and privileges in exchange for their political support. He reformed the Frankish military system, creating a professional class of mounted warriors who owed their status and wealth directly to royal favor. Most importantly, he began the process of transforming Frankish government from a loose confederation of tribal chieftains into a centralized administrative state that could effectively govern vast territories. These innovations would reach their full flowering under his grandson, Charlemagne, who transformed the Frankish kingdom into the Holy Roman Empire and established precedents for royal authority that would influence European politics for the next 1,000 years. But the foundation for Charlemagne's success was laid by Charles Martel's understanding that sustainable monarchy required more than just military prowess. It demanded the creation of institutions and relationships that could outlast any individual ruler. The Carolingian model of kingship combined several elements that would become standard features of medieval monarchy. First, there was the military dimension, based on a professional warrior class that served the king in exchange for land grants and royal favor. Second, there was the administrative component, built around a bureaucracy of literate clerks and officials who could implement royal policy across vast distances. Third, there was the religious aspect, symbolized by royal coronation ceremonies that emphasized the king's role as God's chosen representative on earth. This tripartite foundation of medieval kingship proved remarkably durable, surviving the collapse of the Carolingian Empire and providing the template for royal authority in France, Germany, England, and eventually throughout medieval Europe. But the success of this model also created new challenges and opportunities that would define royal politics for centuries to come. When kings claimed to rule by divine right, they opened themselves to challenges from the church hierarchy that had crowned them. When they built their power on the loyalty of professional warriors, they created a military aristocracy that could potentially threaten royal authority. When they developed sophisticated administrative systems, they needed to find ways to pay for the bureaucrats and infrastructure that effectively the government required. These tensions and contradictions would drive much of the political development of medieval Europe, creating the complex web of relationships between kings, nobles, clergy, and common people that characterized feudal society. But they also created opportunities for exceptional individuals to rise from obscurity to royal power through combinations of talent, ambition, and fortunate circumstances that would have been impossible in more stable political systems. The story of medieval monarchy isn't just about the great dynasties and famous kings whose names everyone remembers. It's equally about the countless forgotten rulers who held power for brief moments before vanishing into historical obscurity, and about the queens, princes, and royal advisors whose influence shaped events even though they never wore crowns themselves. These supporting players in the grand drama of medieval politics often possessed more real power than the nominal rulers they served, and their stories reveal the complex realities of how authority actually functioned in medieval society. As we settle deeper into this 1,000-year journey through royal history, we'll discover how these early experiments in medieval kingship evolved into the sophisticated monarchical systems that would dominate European politics until the modern era. We'll meet rulers who transformed their kingdoms into continental empires and others who lost ancient crowns through single moments of poor judgment. We'll witness the rise of new dynasties from the ashes of fallen predecessors and explore how the constant cycle of royal succession created both stability and chaos in equal measure. But most importantly, we'll come to understand how these medieval kings and queens were neither the perfect heroes nor the complete villains that popular culture often portrays them as being. They were complex human beings operating within systems and constraints that we can barely imagine today, making decisions that would affect millions of lives while often possessing less accurate information about their own kingdoms than we can access about their reigns with a simple internet search. Their stories remind us that history isn't an inevitable progression towards some predetermined outcome, but rather the accumulated result of countless individual choices made by people who could never fully understand the consequences of their actions. The medieval monarchs whose lives we'll explore together tonight shaped our world not through grand strategic plans, but through their responses to immediate crises and opportunities that demanded quick decisions and decisive action. So let us begin this gentle journey through 1,000 years of royal history, where every crown tells a story and every throne holds secrets waiting to be discovered. In the flickering candlelight of medieval courts, we'll find tales of triumph and tragedy that will carry us peacefully towards sleep, while filling our dreams with the pageantry and passion of ages long past. The dawn of the 9th century brought with it winds of change that would reshape the very foundations of European power. As Charlemagne's massive empire began to fragment under the weight of its own ambitions, new opportunities emerged for those bold enough to seize them. The great emperor's death in 814 marked not just the end of a reign, but the beginning of a new chapter in medieval monarchy, where smaller kingdoms would rise to challenge the dominance of continental empires. In the mist-shrouded islands of Britain, a collection of rival kingdoms had been locked in perpetual warfare for centuries. The Anglo-Saxon heptarchy, as historians would later call it, consisted of 7 major realms, each ruled by kings who claimed descent from the gods themselves. Wessex, Mercia, Northumbria, Kent, Essex, Sussex, and East Anglia fought endless battles for supremacy, while Viking longships appeared on the horizon with increasing frequency, bringing with them a new threat that would test every assumption about royal authority and military power. The Vikings weren't simply raiders seeking quick plunder and swift retreat. They were settlers, conquerors, and kingdom builders in their own right, bringing with them political traditions and military innovations that would fundamentally alter the landscape of European monarchy. When they established the Great Heathen Army in 865, they weren't just launching another raiding expedition. They were beginning a systematic conquest that would destroy several Anglo-Saxon kingdoms entirely and force the survivors to adapt or perish. Into this cauldron of violence and uncertainty stepped Alfred, a young prince of Wessex who had never expected to wear a crown. The youngest of 4 brothers, Alfred had been destined for a life in the church until Viking swords carved a path to the throne through his elder siblings' deaths. When he became king in 871, he inherited a kingdom on the brink of collapse, with Viking armies controlling vast swaths of English territory and his own nobles questioning whether resistance was even possible. Alfred's early reign illustrates perfectly how medieval monarchs were forged in the crucible of crisis, rather than the comfort of peaceful succession. His first years as king were marked by constant retreat, desperate negotiations, and the kind of grinding warfare that broke lesser men. There were moments when Alfred ruled little more than the marshlands of Somerset, hiding among the reeds while his enemies carved up his kingdom and distributed it among their own followers. But Alfred possessed something that distinguished him from the countless other medieval kings who simply disappeared into historical footnotes when faced with seemingly insurmountable challenges. He had the intellectual capacity to learn from his defeats and the moral courage to implement radical changes in how his kingdom operated, even when those changes challenged centuries of tradition and custom. The transformation Alfred wrought in Wessex during the late 9th century created a template for effective medieval monarchy that would influence royal governance throughout Europe. He didn't simply focus on military reforms, though his innovations in castle building and naval warfare were revolutionary. He understood that sustainable royal power required what we might today call a comprehensive national strategy that addressed military, economic, educational, and legal challenges simultaneously. Alfred's legal reforms demonstrate how medieval monarchs could use law as an instrument of state building rather than simply a means of resolving disputes. His law code, known as the Doom Book, wasn't just a collection of traditional customs and penalties. It was a deliberate attempt to create a unified legal system that could bind together the diverse populations of his kingdom under common standards of justice and royal authority. The code drew from multiple sources, combining Anglo-Saxon tradition with Christian teachings and practical innovations designed to address contemporary problems. Most importantly, it established the principle that royal law superseded local custom when the two came into conflict, giving Alfred and his successors a powerful tool for extending central authority into regions that had traditionally governed themselves according to tribal or regional traditions. But perhaps Alfred's most far-sighted innovation was his recognition that long-term royal success required an educated population capable of understanding and implementing royal policies. His educational reforms, which mandated that all freeborn English boys learn to read in their native language, created a literate administrative class that could serve royal government effectively, while also producing a population capable of understanding written laws and royal proclamations. This emphasis on education and literacy set Alfred apart from most of his contemporary monarchs, who viewed learning as the exclusive province of the church and saw little connection between popular education and effective governance. Alfred understood that royal power in an increasingly complex world required not just the ability to command obedience, but also the capacity to communicate sophisticated policies to diverse populations across vast territories. The success of Alfred's reforms became apparent during the reigns of his successors, who used the institutional foundations he had established to complete the conquest of England and create the first truly unified English kingdom. Edward the Elder and Athelstan built upon Alfred's military innovations to systematically recapture Viking-controlled territory while using his legal and administrative reforms to integrate conquered populations into an expanding royal state. The creation of the Kingdom of England under the West Saxon dynasty demonstrates how medieval monarchy could evolve from desperate survival strategies into sophisticated systems of governance that outlasted the individuals who created them. By the mid-10th century, English kings commanded resources and authority that dwarfed those available to their 9th century predecessors, not because they were more personally capable, but because they had inherited and refined institutional innovations that multiplied royal power across multiple generations. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, a different model of medieval monarchy was emerging in the fragmented territories of what had once been Charlemagne's empire. The collapse of Carolingian authority hadn't led to chaos and barbarism, as many contemporary observers feared. Instead, it had created opportunities for local strongmen to establish new forms of royal authority based on more realistic assessments of what individual monarchs could actually accomplish with the resources available to them. The emergence of the Capetian dynasty in France illustrates how medieval royal families could build lasting power through patience, strategic marriage alliances, and careful cultivation of relationships with the church hierarchy. Hugh Capet, who became king of the Franks in 987, controlled a little territory beyond the immediate vicinity of Paris when he first claimed the crown. His royal authority was largely theoretical outside his own domains, and many of his supposed vassals commanded more actual military and economic power than he did. But Hugh Capet and his successors understood something that the later Carolingians had forgotten. Medieval monarchy wasn't about controlling every aspect of government throughout vast territories. It was about establishing yourself as the ultimate source of political legitimacy while building coalitions of support that could sustain royal authority across multiple generations. The early Capetians achieved this through a combination of strategic humility and tactical brilliance that gradually transformed them from regional power brokers into the masters of medieval Europe's most successful monarchy. The Capetian approach to royal power was fundamentally different from the imperial ambitions that had ultimately destroyed their Carolingian predecessors. Instead of trying to recreate Charlemagne's empire through military conquest, they focused on consolidating control over their existing territories while building relationships with powerful nobles who could extend royal influence through voluntary cooperation rather than forced submission. This strategy required a fundamentally different conception of what medieval kingship could and should accomplish. The early Capetians presented themselves not as absolute rulers, who commanded obedience through superior force, but as first among equals, who deserved loyalty because they could provide effective leadership and protect the interests of their supporters. This approach was less dramatic than the imperial ambitions of their predecessors, but it proved far more durable over the long term. The success of the Capetian model becomes apparent when we consider the longevity of their dynasty, which would rule France in direct line for over 3 centuries and through cadet branches for several centuries more. Their ability to maintain royal authority across such an extended period wasn't due to superior military might or administrative efficiency, but rather to their understanding of how to work within the constraints and opportunities created by medieval political systems. As we move deeper into the 10th and 11th centuries, we encounter a medieval world where the basic patterns of royal authority had been established, but were still evolving in response to new challenges and opportunities. The Viking Age was drawing to a close, but its impact on European monarchy would be felt for generations as the descendants of Viking settlers established their own royal dynasties throughout Europe. In Normandy, the descendants of the Viking chieftain Rollo had transformed themselves from Norse raiders into French nobles, adopting the language, customs, and political traditions of their adopted homeland, while retaining the military prowess and territorial ambitions that had made their ancestors so formidable. The Norman dukes of the 10th and 11th centuries represent a fascinating synthesis of Viking warrior culture and Frankish administrative sophistication that would ultimately reshape the political landscape of medieval Europe. The Norman conquest of England in 1066 wasn't simply a military campaign or dynastic dispute. It was the collision of two different models of medieval monarchy, each with its own strengths and limitations. The Anglo-Saxon system that had evolved under Alfred and his successors emphasized institutional continuity and legal uniformity, creating a kingdom where royal authority was embedded in established customs and administrative procedures. The Norman system, by contrast, was more personal and hierarchical, based on direct relationships between the Duke and his followers, rather than abstract legal principles. When William the Conqueror defeated Harold Godwinson at the Battle of Hastings, he wasn't just claiming the English crown for himself. He was beginning a process of political and social transformation that would create a new hybrid form of medieval monarchy, combining Anglo-Saxon administrative sophistication with Norman military efficiency and hierarchical organization. The Norman conquest illustrates how medieval monarchy could be simultaneously conservative and revolutionary, preserving existing institutions while transforming their fundamental character through changes in leadership and political culture. William claimed to be the legitimate heir to Edward the Confessor and insisted that he was simply claiming his rightful inheritance rather than conquering a foreign kingdom. But the changes he implemented in English government and society were so profound that they created what was essentially a new kingdom, with only superficial resemblance to its Anglo-Saxon predecessor. This pattern of claiming continuity while implementing radical change would become a common feature of medieval royal transitions, allowing new dynasties to legitimize their authority by appealing to traditional precedents while adapting governmental systems to meet contemporary challenges and opportunities. The ability to balance innovation with tradition became one of the key skills that separated successful medieval monarchs from those who either lost their thrones through excessive conservatism or destroyed their kingdoms through reckless experimentation. As the 11th century progressed toward its close, the basic structures of medieval monarchy that would dominate European politics for the next several centuries had been established. Kings ruled through combinations of personal charisma, institutional authority, and divine sanction. But the specific balance between these elements varied significantly from kingdom to kingdom and dynasty to dynasty. The stage was set for the great age of medieval monarchy, when royal authority would reach its zenith and the crowned heads of Europe would compete for dominance on a continental scale. The 12th century dawned like a golden age for medieval monarchy, bringing with it a constellation of rulers whose ambitions would stretch from the foggy moors of Scotland to the sun-baked stones of Jerusalem. This was the era when kings truly began to think beyond the borders of their inherited domains, when the concept of royal authority expanded to encompass not just local governance, but continental politics and even divine mission. In the heart of this transformation stood Henry Plantagenet, a young man whose inheritance would make him the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, while simultaneously creating the conditions for centuries of conflict that would reshape the political landscape forever. When Henry became King of England in 1154, he didn't simply inherit a throne. He acquired an empire that stretched from the Scottish borders to the Pyrenees, a patchwork of territories held together by nothing more substantial than his personal authority and the complex web of feudal obligations that medieval lawyers spent lifetimes trying to understand. The Angevin Empire, as historians would later call Henry's domains, represented both the pinnacle of medieval royal achievement and its fundamental contradiction. Never before had a single monarch controlled such vast territories or commanded such diverse populations. Yet this apparent strength concealed weaknesses that would eventually tear the empire apart, demonstrating how medieval monarchy remained fundamentally personal rather than institutional, dependent on the capabilities of individual rulers rather than the strength of governmental systems. Henry himself embodied the contradictions of 12th century kingship. He was simultaneously a patron of learning, who transformed royal administration, and a violent tyrant whose rage could destroy lives with a careless word. His court attracted the finest minds of medieval Europe, producing innovations in law, literature, and governance that would influence Western civilization for centuries. Yet this same court was the setting for family feuds so vicious that they scandalized even contemporaries who were accustomed to dynastic violence as a normal feature of royal politics. The tragedy of Thomas Becket illustrates perfectly how personal relationships could collide with institutional authority in ways that medieval political systems were ill-equipped to handle. Henry and Thomas had been intimate friends, companions who shared jokes and confidences in ways that would have been impossible between a king and his subjects under more formal royal protocols. When Henry appointed Thomas as Archbishop of Canterbury, he expected their friendship to continue smoothing over the traditional conflicts between royal and ecclesiastical authority that had plagued medieval monarchs for generations. But Thomas understood something that Henry had missed about the nature of medieval authority. Once he accepted the archbishop's mitre, Thomas was no longer simply the king's friend who happened to hold high religious office. He had become the representative of an institution whose authority derived from sources beyond royal control, and whose obligations sometimes required opposition to royal policy, regardless of personal relationships or political consequences. The conflict that developed between Henry and Thomas wasn't simply about competing jurisdictions or abstract principles of governance. It was about two different conceptions of how authority should function in medieval society, and whether personal loyalty could override institutional obligation when the two came into conflict. Henry believed that Thomas owed him personal loyalty that should supersede any other considerations, while Thomas insisted that his duty to the church required him to oppose royal policies that threatened ecclesiastical independence. This fundamental disagreement about the nature of authority and obligation would culminate in Thomas's murder in Canterbury Cathedral, an event that shocked medieval Europe and demonstrated how easily personal conflicts could escalate into political crises that threatened the stability of entire kingdoms. Henry's role in Thomas's death, whether direct or indirect, illustrated the dangers that medieval monarchs faced when their personal relationships became entangled with institutional conflicts they couldn't control through conventional political means. The Becket affair also revealed how medieval kings were constrained by forces beyond their immediate political control. Henry was the most powerful monarch in Western Europe, commanding resources and authority that dwarfed those available to most of his contemporaries. Yet he found himself unable to simply resolve his conflict with Thomas through royal command, because Thomas's authority derived from sources that operated independently of royal control, and according to principles that didn't recognize royal supremacy in all matters. This limitation of royal authority would become increasingly apparent as medieval monarchy evolved throughout the 12th and 13th centuries. Kings found themselves operating within complex networks of competing authorities and overlapping jurisdictions that required constant negotiation and compromise rather than simple command and obedience. The church, the nobility, emerging urban centers, and even peasant communities all possessed their own sources of authority and their own conceptions of legitimate governance that couldn't be easily overridden by royal decree. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the Capetian monarchy in France was developing along different lines that would eventually prove more durable than the Angevin model. Louis VII and his successors understood that sustainable royal power required patience and systematic expansion rather than dramatic conquests and personal empire building. While Henry Plantagenet was struggling to hold together his vast but unwieldy domains, the French kings were methodically extending their authority throughout their traditional territories, while building institutions that could outlast any individual monarch. The contrast between Angevin and Capetian approaches to royal power became particularly apparent during the reign of Philip Augustus, who transformed France from a collection of loosely connected territories into a unified kingdom capable of challenging English dominance in continental Europe. Philip's success wasn't based on superior military might or administrative genius, though he possessed both in abundance. Rather, it derived from his understanding of how to work within the constraints of medieval political systems, while gradually expanding royal authority through legal precedent and institutional innovation. Philip's conquest of Normandy in 1204 marked a turning point in medieval European politics, demonstrating that even the most powerful royal empires could collapse when their foundations proved insufficiently strong to support their ambitious superstructure. The loss of Normandy didn't just represent a territorial defeat for the English monarchy. It revealed the fundamental weakness of personal empires that depended on individual capability rather than institutional strength for their continued existence. The collapse of Angevin continental power also illustrated how medieval monarchy remained vulnerable to the biological lottery of royal succession. Henry's empire had been held together by his personal authority and administrative capability, but his sons lacked both the talent and the cooperation necessary to maintain what their father had built. Richard spent most of his reign on crusade, leaving England to be governed by administrators, while he pursued military glory in the Holy Land. John combined personal incompetence with political recklessness in ways that alienated virtually every important constituency in his kingdom. The contrast between Richard and John as monarchs demonstrates how medieval kingship required a unique combination of abilities that were rarely found in the same individual. Richard was a brilliant military commander whose reputation for personal courage and tactical innovation made him a legend throughout medieval Europe. But his obsession with military glory left him little time or inclination for the administrative work that effective monarchy required, and his frequent absences from England created power vacuums that ambitious nobles were happy to fill. John possessed neither his brother's military reputation nor his father's administrative competence, but he inherited all the problems that their neglect of English domestic politics had created. When he lost Normandy to Philip Augustus, he didn't just suffer a military defeat. He lost the continental territories that had provided much of the Angevin monarchy's wealth and strategic depth, forcing him to rely more heavily on English resources while lacking the political skills necessary to extract those resources without provoking rebellion. The baronial revolt that culminated in Magna Carta represents a watershed moment in the development of medieval monarchy, marking the beginning of a new relationship between royal authority and noble consent that would influence constitutional development throughout Europe. The barons who forced John to accept limitations on royal power weren't revolutionary democrats seeking to overthrow monarchy itself. They were conservative nobles trying to restore what they viewed as traditional balance between royal authority and aristocratic privilege that John's incompetence had disrupted. But the precedent established at Runnymede would prove far more significant than its creators intended. The principle that even kings were bound by law and subject to institutional constraints would evolve over subsequent centuries into constitutional limitations that fundamentally altered the nature of royal authority. Medieval monarchy would never again be quite as personal or arbitrary as it had been during the height of the Angevin Empire. The 13th century brought new challenges and opportunities that would test these evolving limitations on royal power. The rise of universities created new sources of expertise and authority that operated independently of royal control. The growth of commercial centers produced wealthy merchant classes, whose economic power gave them political influence that couldn't be easily ignored. The expansion of literacy created populations capable of understanding and critiquing royal policies in ways that had been impossible when political communication was limited to small circles of nobles and clergy. Perhaps most significantly, the 13th century witnessed the emergence of new forms of royal ambition that extended far beyond traditional territorial conquest. The Crusades had introduced European monarchs to the concept of holy war and divine mission that could justify enormous expenditures of resources and human life in pursuit of spiritual rather than merely political objectives. Kings like Louis IX of France and Edward I of England would spend vast portions of their reigns pursuing crusading goals that transform their kingdoms, while creating new forms of royal authority based on religious rather than purely secular foundations. Louis IX, later canonized as Saint Louis, represents perhaps the highest development of medieval royal authority based on personal sanctity and divine mission. His reign demonstrated how medieval monarchs could transcend the ordinary limitations of political power by successfully claiming direct divine sanction for their authority. Louis wasn't simply a king who happened to be religious. He was a monarch whose political authority derived partly from his reputation for personal holiness and his ability to present royal policy as the implementation of divine will. This religious dimension of medieval monarchy would become increasingly important during the later medieval period, as kings sought new sources of legitimacy to support their expanding ambitions and growing governmental apparatus. The costs of medieval warfare were escalating rapidly, requiring kings to extract ever larger amounts of resources from their subjects while providing convincing justifications for these increasing demands. Religious authority offered one solution to this problem, allowing kings to present their policies as divinely mandated rather than merely politically expedient. But the religious justification of royal authority also created new vulnerabilities and constraints that medieval monarchs had to navigate carefully. Kings who claimed divine sanction for their authority opened themselves to criticism when their policies produced results that seemed inconsistent with divine blessing. Military defeats, natural disasters, and economic disruptions could all be interpreted as signs of divine displeasure that undermined royal claims to religious authority. The interplay between secular and religious sources of royal legitimacy would become one of the defining characteristics of later medieval monarchy, creating both opportunities and dangers that would shape European political development for centuries to come. As we move deeper into this 1,000-year journey through royal history, we'll discover how these competing sources of authority would interact with new challenges and opportunities to create the complex political systems that would eventually evolve into the modern European state. The stories of these medieval monarchs remind us that political authority has always been more fragile and contingent than it appears from the outside, dependent on the constant negotiation of competing interests and the maintenance of coalitions that could dissolve overnight if royal policies failed to meet the expectations of key constituencies. In the flickering torchlight of medieval courts, we can glimpse the eternal human struggle to create order from chaos while preserving the freedom that makes life worth living. The 14th century arrived like a storm breaking over Europe, bringing with it challenges that would test every assumption about royal authority and divine favor. The Great Famine of 1315 stretched across the continent like a skeletal hand, followed by the Black Death that would claim 1/3 of Europe's population and leave survivors questioning whether God himself had abandoned the crowned heads who claimed to rule in his name. Into this world of uncertainty stepped Edward III of England, a young monarch whose ambitions would ignite the 100 Years' War and transform medieval warfare forever. Edward understood something that many of his contemporaries missed about the changing nature of royal power in an age of crisis. Traditional feudal obligations and ancient claims to legitimacy weren't sufficient when faced with existential threats that challenged the very foundations of medieval society. Kings needed to offer their subjects something more tangible than abstract rights and theoretical authority if they wanted to maintain their thrones during times when death stalked every village and famine emptied royal treasuries as efficiently as any military defeat. Edward's solution was characteristically bold and entirely unprecedented. He would make war pay for itself by transforming military campaigns from expensive obligations into profitable enterprises that could enrich his followers while expanding English power throughout Europe. The chevauchée tactics he developed weren't simply military strategies. They were economic instruments that allowed English armies to sustain themselves through systematic plunder while demonstrating royal power in ways that traditional diplomatic methods could never achieve. The transformation of medieval warfare under Edward III reveals how 14th century monarchs adapted to new realities that their predecessors could never have imagined. The mounted knights who had dominated battlefields for centuries found themselves vulnerable to English longbowmen whose weapons could penetrate the finest armor at distances that made traditional cavalry charges suicidal. The battles of Crécy and Poitiers didn't just represent English military victories. They demonstrated that technological innovation and tactical flexibility could overcome the hereditary military advantages that noble birth and expensive equipment had provided for generations. But Edward's military innovations created political problems that he struggled to solve throughout his long reign. The wealth that successful campaigns brought back to England created expectations among his followers that required constant warfare to satisfy. Knights and nobles who had enriched themselves through French plunder weren't content to return to the modest incomes that traditional English estates could provide. They needed continuing military success to maintain the lifestyle that victory had made possible, creating a cycle of expansion that eventually overextended English resources and led to the military disasters of the late 14th century. The reign of Edward's grandson, Richard II, illustrates perfectly how the military successes of one generation could become the political burdens of the next. Richard inherited a kingdom exhausted by decades of warfare and a nobility accustomed to the profits that successful military campaigns could provide. When he proved unable to maintain English military dominance in France, his nobles began looking for alternative sources of wealth and power that inevitably brought them into conflict with royal authority. Richard's response to these challenges reveals both the possibilities and limitations of royal power in an age when traditional sources of authority were being questioned throughout Europe. He attempted to develop new forms of royal ceremony and courtly culture that could inspire loyalty through aesthetic beauty and cultural sophistication rather than military success and material reward. His court became a center of artistic innovation and literary achievement that produced some of the finest cultural works of the medieval period, including the poetry of Geoffrey Chaucer and the architectural masterpieces that still grace English cathedrals and royal palaces. But Richard's cultural innovations couldn't compensate for his political failures, and his reign ended in deposition and murder when his cousin Henry Bolingbroke seized the throne through a combination of military force and noble conspiracy. The usurpation that brought the Lancastrian dynasty to power marked a new phase in English royal history, where kings would need to prove their legitimacy through successful governance, rather than simply claiming it through hereditary right or divine sanction. Meanwhile, in France, the Valois monarchy was facing its own crisis of legitimacy as military defeats and territorial losses called into question the divine favor that French kings had claimed for centuries. The capture of John II at Poitiers in 1356 represented more than just a military disaster. It demonstrated that French royal claims to divine protection were insufficient to guarantee victory over enemies who possessed superior tactics and technology. The regency of the Dauphin, later Charles V, during his father's captivity in England, revealed how medieval monarchy could adapt to unprecedented circumstances through institutional innovation and administrative reform. Charles understood that French military failures weren't simply due to bad luck or divine displeasure, but resulted from fundamental weaknesses in how the French kingdom organized and financed its military forces. His reforms created new systems of taxation, military organization, and diplomatic coordination that would eventually enable France to reverse its earlier defeats and drive English forces from most of their continental territories. Charles V's success demonstrates how 14th century monarchy was evolving beyond the personal authority and feudal relationships that had characterized earlier medieval kingship. Effective royal government increasingly required sophisticated administrative systems, professional military forces, and reliable sources of revenue that could function independently of the personal capabilities of individual monarchs. Kings who mastered these new requirements could achieve remarkable results, while those who clung to traditional methods found themselves overwhelmed by challenges that their predecessors had never faced. The contrast between French recovery under Charles V and English decline under Richard II illustrates how rapidly political fortunes could change when royal policies proved inadequate to contemporary challenges. Charles built his success on careful attention to administrative detail and systematic reform of governmental institutions, while Richard focused on cultural achievement and ceremonial innovation that, however beautiful, couldn't address the fundamental political and economic problems his kingdom faced. But perhaps the most significant development of the 14th century wasn't occurring in the courts of major monarchs at all. Instead, it was taking place in the emerging urban centres, where merchant classes were accumulating wealth and political influence that operated independently of traditional royal control. Cities like Florence, Venice, and the Flemish textile centres were creating new forms of governmental authority based on commercial success and collective decision-making rather than hereditary privilege and individual command. These urban republics represented a fundamental challenge to medieval monarchies' claim to be the only legitimate form of political organisation. Their success demonstrated that effective governance didn't require kings or nobles, and that communities could prosper through cooperative institutions that distributed power among multiple stakeholders rather than concentrating it in single individuals. The wealth and military power that these cities commanded made them formidable players in European politics, capable of challenging royal authority when their interests conflicted with monarchical policies. The rise of urban political power also created new opportunities for ambitious individuals who could navigate between royal courts and merchant guilds, ecclesiastical hierarchies, and university communities. The 14th century produced a remarkable generation of political figures who weren't born to noble rank but achieved influence through combinations of talent, education, and strategic positioning that would have been impossible in earlier periods when political authority was more rigidly controlled by hereditary elites. Jacques van Artevelde in Flanders, Cola di Rienzi in Rome, and Etienne Marcel in Paris all represent this new type of medieval political leader who could mobilize popular support against established authorities while claiming to represent more authentic forms of governance than traditional monarchy could provide. Their careers were typically brief and often ended violently, but their example inspired others and demonstrated that royal authority was no longer automatically accepted as legitimate simply because it was traditional. The papal crisis that developed during this same period further undermined traditional sources of authority throughout Europe. When rival popes in Rome and Avignon claimed exclusive legitimacy while excommunicating each other and all their supporters, the entire framework of Christian authority that had provided spiritual sanction for medieval monarchy collapsed into confusion and contradiction. Kings found themselves forced to choose between competing papal claimants, with their choices determining not only their diplomatic relationships, but also their subjects' eternal salvation, according to the theological authorities they had previously relied upon for legitimacy. This great schism revealed how dependent medieval monarchy had become on ecclesiastical support for its claims to divine authority. When the Church itself was divided and its spiritual authority questioned, royal claims to rule by divine right became much more difficult to sustain. Kings needed to find alternative sources of legitimacy that could function independently of papal approval, leading to new emphasis on national identity, military success, and administrative competence as foundations for royal authority. The development of national consciousness during the 14th century created both opportunities and constraints for medieval monarchs. Kings who successfully identified themselves with emerging national identities could mobilize popular support in ways that their predecessors had never achieved. But this same national consciousness could be turned against monarchs whose policies seemed to betray national interests or whose personal qualities failed to meet national expectations. The career of Joan of Arc illustrates perfectly how national consciousness could transform individual political actors into forces that transcended traditional categories of medieval authority. Joan wasn't a noble or a cleric, a wealthy merchant or a learned scholar. She was a peasant girl whose visions and charismatic leadership enabled her to convince the Dauphin of France to provide her with military command during the darkest period of the 100 Years' War. Joan's success in raising the siege of Orléans and enabling Charles VII's coronation at Reims demonstrated that legitimate authority could emerge from sources that traditional medieval political theory couldn't explain or accommodate. Her divine visions provided spiritual sanction that didn't depend on papal approval, while her military victories proved divine favor in ways that traditional royal ceremonies could never achieve. Most importantly, her identification with French national resistance created popular support that transcended the feudal obligations and personal loyalties that had previously defined political relationships. But Joan's career also revealed the dangers that unconventional sources of authority could pose to established political systems. Her success threatened not only English military dominance in France, but also traditional assumptions about gender, social hierarchy, and the proper sources of political legitimacy. When she was captured and tried for heresy, the charges against her weren't simply about her religious visions or military activities. They concerned her challenge to fundamental principles of how authority should function in medieval society. The trial and execution of Joan of Arc marked a turning point in medieval political culture, demonstrating that traditional authorities would use extreme measures to suppress challenges to established systems of power and legitimacy. But Joan's martyrdom also created a powerful symbol of national resistance and divine mission that would inspire future generations and contribute to the development of new forms of political consciousness that medieval institutions were poorly equipped to control or channel. As the 14th century drew to its close, the basic structures of medieval monarchy had been permanently altered by the crises and innovations of this transformative period. Kings could no longer rely solely on traditional sources of authority based on hereditary right, feudal obligation, and ecclesiastical sanction. They needed to prove their legitimacy through successful governance, military victory, and effective representation of emerging national interests that operated according to principles quite different from those that had sustained medieval political systems for centuries. The 15th century would bring new challenges and opportunities that would test these evolving forms of royal authority in ways that would ultimately transform medieval monarchy into the early modern state systems that would dominate European politics until the democratic revolutions of the modern era. But the foundations for these later developments were established during the 14th century, when crisis and innovation combined to create new possibilities for both royal authority and popular resistance that would shape European political development for centuries to come. In the gentle darkness of evening, as we continue our journey through these ancient halls of power, we can sense the weight of these transformations settling around us like dust motes in cathedral light. The medieval world was changing in ways that even its most perceptive observers couldn't fully understand, creating new forms of political possibility while destroying others that had seemed as permanent as the stones of royal castles themselves. The kings and queens of this era weren't simply responding to immediate crises, but unknowingly laying foundations for political systems that would outlast their dynasties by centuries, i.e., by centuries. The dawn of the 15th century brought with it a peculiar quietude, as if Europe itself was catching its breath after the tumultuous transformations of the previous 100 years. Yet beneath this deceptive calm, forces were stirring that would reshape the very essence of what it meant to wear a crown. The monarchs of this era inherited kingdoms that bore little resemblance to those their great-grandfathers had ruled, and they would need to master entirely new forms of statecraft to survive in a world where tradition and innovation danced an increasingly complex waltz. In the frost-covered halls of Westminster, Henry V ascended to the English throne with dreams that stretched far beyond the fog-shrouded shores of his island kingdom. Unlike his predecessors, who had stumbled into continental warfare through dynastic accident or feudal obligation, Henry approached the renewal of the French conflict with the calculating precision of a master craftsman. He understood that 15th century monarchy required not just military victory, but the kind of overwhelming success that could unite fractured kingdoms behind a shared sense of destiny and divine purpose. The Battle of Agincourt in 1415 would become the stuff of legend. But its true significance lay not in the tactical brilliance that destroyed French chivalry in a single afternoon, but in how Henry transformed military triumph into a new form of royal authority that transcended traditional feudal relationships. The English longbowmen who cut down French knights weren't simply common soldiers serving their feudal obligations. They were participants in a national enterprise that made each archer a stakeholder in royal success while binding king and commoner together through shared sacrifice and mutual dependence. Henry's innovations in royal propaganda and public ceremony created new ways of communicating with subjects who were no longer content to accept royal authority without understanding its purposes and benefits. His use of the English language in official documents and public proclamations wasn't simply a practical administrative decision. It was a deliberate strategy to create direct relationships between monarch and subject that bypassed the traditional intermediary roles of nobles and clergy who had previously controlled political communication. But Henry's greatest innovation was his understanding of how royal personality could become a political instrument in its own right. Previous medieval monarchs had relied on ceremonial distance and ritual formality to inspire awe and obedience among their subjects. Henry discovered that carefully managed displays of royal humanity could create emotional bonds between king and people that were far more powerful than traditional forms of political obligation. The stories of Henry mingling with common soldiers on the eve of Agincourt, sharing their fears and strengthening their resolve through personal example, weren't simply romantic legends created by later chroniclers. They reflected a deliberate royal strategy to transform kingship from remote authority into inspiring leadership that could motivate extraordinary effort and sacrifice from ordinary people. This personalization of royal authority would become one of the defining characteristics of Renaissance monarchy, creating both unprecedented opportunities for effective leadership and new vulnerabilities when royal personalities failed to meet popular expectations. Henry's premature death in 1422 demonstrated how dependent these new forms of royal authority remained on the personal qualities of individual monarchs. His infant son inherited a kingdom and an empire that required constant personal leadership to maintain, but lacked the age and experience necessary to provide that leadership during the crucial years when English dominance in France hung in the balance. The regency that governed England during Henry VI's minority faced challenges that no institutional innovations could solve, revealing the continuing limitations of medieval political systems that remained fundamentally personal rather than truly institutional. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the French monarchy was discovering its own path toward renewed authority through very different innovations that emphasized institutional continuity over personal charisma. Charles VII, the Dauphin, whom Joan of Arc had enabled to claim his crown, proved to be a far more capable monarch than his early career had suggested. His reign marked the beginning of a systematic reconstruction of French royal power that would eventually enable France to emerge from the 100 Years' War as the dominant European monarchy. Charles's military reforms created the first truly professional royal army in medieval Europe, with standardized equipment, regular pay, and systematic training that transformed warfare from the chaotic clashes of feudal levies into the disciplined campaigns of professional soldiers. But more importantly, these military innovations were embedded within broader administrative reforms that created new systems of taxation, legal administration, and territorial governance that could function effectively regardless of the personal qualities of individual monarchs. The emergence of standing armies represented a fundamental transformation in the relationship between monarchs and their subjects, creating new forms of royal power while imposing new obligations and expectations on royal government. Professional soldiers owed their loyalty directly to the crown, rather than to local nobles or feudal obligations, giving kings military forces that could be deployed against domestic as well as foreign enemies. But these same professional forces required regular payment and systematic provisioning that demanded much more sophisticated financial and administrative systems than medieval kingdoms had previously possessed. The development of effective royal taxation during this period marked another crucial step in the evolution from medieval to early modern monarchy. Previous royal revenues had been based primarily on feudal obligations, customary payments, and occasional extraordinary grants that nobles and clergy could resist when royal policies conflicted with their interests. The new taxation systems that emerged during the 15th century created regular, predictable sources of royal revenue that enabled monarchs to plan long-term policies while reducing their dependence on the cooperation of traditional elites. But these fiscal innovations also created new forms of political relationship between monarchs and their subjects that would eventually challenge the theoretical foundations of royal authority. When kings claimed the right to tax their subjects regularly and systematically, they implicitly acknowledged that royal government existed to serve the interests of those who paid for it. This recognition would eventually evolve into concepts of governmental accountability and popular consent that would fundamentally alter the nature of political authority throughout Europe. The Italian peninsula during this period provided a fascinating laboratory for experimenting with alternative forms of political organization that challenged traditional assumptions about the necessity and desirability of monarchical government. The city-states of northern Italy had developed sophisticated republican institutions that demonstrated how effective governance could emerge from collective decision-making and competitive elections rather than hereditary succession and individual command. Florence under the Medici represented perhaps the most successful synthesis of republican institutions with practical autocracy, creating a form of government that preserved the forms of popular participation while concentrating real power in the hands of a single family that ruled through wealth and influence rather than formal royal title. The Medici model demonstrated how political authority could be based on economic success and cultural patronage rather than military conquest and divine sanction, creating new possibilities for ambitious individuals who lacked traditional claims to legitimate rule. The Papal States presented yet another alternative model of political organization, where spiritual authority provided the foundation for temporal power in ways that created unique opportunities and constraints for papal governance. The Renaissance popes who ruled during this period faced the challenge of maintaining their spiritual authority while competing with secular monarchs for territorial control and political influence throughout Europe. Their success or failure in balancing these competing obligations would have profound implications for the development of both religious and secular authority throughout the continent. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire as a major European power during the 15th century introduced entirely new forms of political organization that challenged Christian assumptions about legitimate governance, while demonstrating the military effectiveness of centralized autocracy supported by professional administration and religious authority. The Ottoman system combined elements of Byzantine imperial tradition, Islamic legal principles, and Turkish military organization in ways that created one of the most effective governmental systems of the early modern period. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked more than just the end of the Byzantine Empire. It represented the arrival of a new form of monarchy that could compete successfully with European Christian kingdoms while operating according to fundamentally different principles of political organization and religious authority. The Ottoman sultans, who established themselves in the former Byzantine capital, created a form of royal power that was simultaneously more centralized and more systematic than anything European Christianity had produced, while remaining more flexible and adaptive than the increasingly rigid systems that were developing in Western Europe. The impact of Ottoman expansion on European monarchy was both immediate and long-term, forcing Christian kings to develop new strategies for military organization and diplomatic cooperation, while also providing alternative models of effective governance that influenced European political development in subtle but significant ways. The Ottoman example demonstrated that successful monarchy didn't require the complex feudal relationships and ecclesiastical sanctions that European political theorists had long considered essential for legitimate rule. The invention of printing during this same period created revolutionary new possibilities for royal communication and political organization that would fundamentally alter the relationship between monarchs and their subjects. For the first time in human history, rulers could communicate directly with large populations through printed proclamations, official chronicles, and royal propaganda that bypassed traditional intermediaries, while creating new forms of public opinion and political participation. The printing revolution also democratized access to the classical texts and historical examples that had previously been available only to small circles of educated elites, creating new constituencies for political reform and institutional innovation that operated independently of traditional royal control. Universities proliferated throughout Europe during this period, producing increasing numbers of lawyers, administrators, and intellectuals whose expertise made them valuable to royal government, while also providing them with independent sources of authority and income that reduced their dependence on royal favor. The growth of commerce and banking during the 15th century created yet another challenge to traditional forms of royal authority. As merchant families accumulated wealth that could rival royal treasuries while developing international networks that operated according to commercial rather than political principles. The Fuggers of Augsburg, the Medici of Florence, and similar banking dynasties throughout Europe possessed resources and influence that enabled them to manipulate royal policies while maintaining their independence from direct royal control. These commercial networks also created new forms of international relationship that operated independently of traditional diplomatic channels, as merchants and bankers developed their own systems of communication and cooperation that could facilitate or obstruct royal policies depending on how those policies affected commercial interests. The emergence of international capitalism during this period would eventually transform the economic foundations of royal power while creating new forms of wealth and influence that monarchs would need to accommodate or control if they wanted to maintain their authority. The marriage politics that dominated European diplomacy during the 15th century reflected the continuing importance of dynastic relationships in an age when other forms of political organization were becoming increasingly significant. The complex web of marriages, inheritances, and succession disputes that characterized this period created opportunities for ambitious dynasties to expand their territories and influence, while also generating conflicts that could destabilize entire regions when competing claims collided. The union of Castile and Aragon through the marriage of Isabella and Ferdinand created the foundation for Spanish dominance in European politics that would last for centuries, while also providing a model for how strategic marriages could transform regional monarchies into continental powers. But the same dynastic strategies that enabled Spanish expansion also created the succession crises and territorial disputes that would generate warfare throughout Europe as competing royal families pursued conflicting claims to multiple thrones. The Burgundian inheritance that would eventually pass to the Habsburg dynasty represented perhaps the most significant example of how marriage politics could reshape the European balance of power in ways that no one could fully anticipate or control. When Charles the Bold died in 1477, leaving only a daughter as his heir, the rich Burgundian territories that included much of modern Belgium and the Netherlands became the object of intense competition between France and the Holy Roman Empire that would influence European politics for generations. The resolution of the Burgundian succession through the marriage of Mary of Burgundy to Maximilian of Austria created new possibilities for Habsburg expansion, while also ensuring that French and Habsburg interests would conflict throughout Europe for centuries to come. The personal union of territories that resulted from this marriage would eventually grow into the vast Habsburg dominions that would dominate European politics during the 16th and 17th centuries. demonstrating how individual dynastic decisions could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate intentions of those who made them. As the 15th century drew toward its close, the basic structures of early modern monarchy were beginning to emerge from the institutional innovations and political experiments of the previous 100 years. Royal authority was becoming more systematic and bureaucratic, less dependent on personal relationships and feudal obligations, but also more complex and demanding in ways that required new forms of expertise and administrative capability. The monarchs who would inherit these evolving systems of royal power would need to master new skills and navigate new challenges that their medieval predecessors had never faced. They would rule over populations that were more literate and politically aware, more prosperous and commercially sophisticated, more diverse in their religious beliefs and cultural practices than any previous generation in European history. The kingdoms they governed were larger and more centralized, but also more complex and harder to control through traditional methods of royal authority. The stage was set for the great age of Renaissance monarchy, when royal courts would become centers of artistic innovation and cultural achievement, while also serving as the headquarters for increasingly sophisticated systems of governmental administration and international diplomacy. The kings and queens of the 16th century would inherit the institutional foundations that 15th century monarchs had created, but they would need to adapt those foundations to meet challenges and opportunities that no previous generation had encountered. In the gathering twilight of our journey through these centuries of royal history, we can sense the approaching transformation that would carry medieval monarchy into the modern world. The crowned heads who ruled at the end of the 15th century stood at the threshold of an age that would test every assumption about royal authority, while creating new possibilities for both monarchical power and popular resistance that would reshape European civilization in ways that are still influencing our world today. The quiet halls through which we've wandered together tonight have witnessed the gradual emergence of political systems that would outlast the dynasties that created them, demonstrating how human institutions can evolve and adapt across centuries while preserving essential functions that serve the deepest needs of civilized society. As we continue our gentle exploration of royal history, we'll discover how these late medieval innovations would flourish into the magnificent and terrible realities of Renaissance monarchy, where individual ambition and institutional power would combine to create some of history's most remarkable achievements and most devastating failures. The dawn of the 16th century arrived like a golden trumpet call across Europe, heralding an age when monarchy would reach heights of splendor and depths of complexity that medieval rulers could never have imagined. This was the era when royal courts would become stages for the greatest drama in human history, where individual personalities would shape the destiny of nations, while institutions grew powerful enough to survive the collapse of the very dynasties that created them. In the mist-shrouded courts of Northern Europe, a new generation of monarchs was awakening to possibilities that would have seemed like fantasies to their predecessors. These weren't simply kings and queens inheriting traditional crowns and ancient obligations. They were Renaissance princes who understood that royal authority in this brave new world required mastery of arts and sciences, diplomacy and warfare, religious doctrine and commercial innovation in ways that would transform the very nature of what it meant to rule. Henry VIII of England embodied both the magnificent potential and the terrible dangers of this new form of monarchy. When he ascended the throne in 1509, he inherited a kingdom that his father had transformed from medieval feudalism into something approaching a modern state. The royal treasury was full, the nobility was subdued, and the administrative machinery that would support royal authority for generations had been carefully constructed and tested. Yet Henry would use these advantages to pursue ambitions that would tear his kingdom apart, while simultaneously creating new forms of royal power that would outlast his dynasty by centuries. Henry's early reign seemed to promise everything that Renaissance monarchy could offer. He was young, handsome, and intellectually gifted, equally comfortable discussing theology with learned bishops and competing in tournaments with the finest knights of his court. His marriage to Catherine of Aragon linked him to the most powerful dynasty in Europe, while his friendship with scholars like Thomas More and Erasmus positioned him at the center of the humanist movement that was transforming European intellectual life. But beneath this glittering surface lay contradictions that would eventually destroy both Henry's personal happiness and the religious unity of his kingdom. The king, who had written treatises defending papal authority against Lutheran heresy, would eventually break with Rome entirely when papal policies conflicted with his personal desires. The monarch, who had surrounded himself with the finest legal minds of his generation, would eventually execute those same advisors when their counsel proved inconvenient to his purposes. The annulment crisis that dominated the later years of Henry's reign revealed how personal monarchy could collide with institutional authority in ways that created unprecedented political and religious upheaval. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the English king faced a choice that no medieval monarch had ever confronted. He could accept papal authority and abandon his hopes for a male heir, or he could challenge the spiritual foundations that had legitimized royal authority throughout Christian Europe for over 1,000 years. Henry's decision to break with Rome and establish himself as supreme head of the Church of England created a new form of royal authority that combined temporal and spiritual power in ways that transformed both the English monarchy and European Christianity. The Henrician Reformation wasn't simply a dynastic dispute that got out of hand. It was a deliberate reconstruction of royal authority that replaced papal supremacy with monarchical control over religious doctrine, ecclesiastical appointments, and spiritual authority throughout the kingdom. This revolution in royal power came at enormous cost in human suffering and political stability, but it also created new possibilities for monarchical authority that would influence European development for centuries. English kings would never again need to negotiate with papal authority when their policies conflicted with church doctrine, but they would also bear sole responsibility for the spiritual welfare of their subjects in ways that created new vulnerabilities and obligations that medieval monarchs had never faced. The dissolution of the monasteries that accompanied Henry's break with Rome demonstrated how Renaissance monarchy could use religious reform as an instrument of political and economic transformation that strengthened royal power while destroying traditional sources of alternative authority. The monastic lands that Henry seized and redistributed didn't simply enrich the royal treasury and reward loyal supporters. They created new classes of landowners whose wealth and status depended entirely on the continuation of royal policies that had made their prosperity possible. Meanwhile, across the Channel, the French monarchy under Francis I was developing along different lines that emphasized cultural achievement and artistic patronage as foundations for royal authority. Francis understood that Renaissance kingship required more than military victory and administrative competence. It demanded the kind of cultural sophistication and intellectual refinement that could inspire loyalty through aesthetic beauty and artistic innovation rather than simple fear or material reward. The court that Francis created at Fontainebleau became a model for royal magnificence that influenced monarchical culture throughout Europe, demonstrating how artistic patronage could serve political purposes while genuinely advancing human knowledge and creative achievement. The Italian artists, French poets, and international scholars who gathered around Francis created new forms of courtly culture that celebrated royal authority while also preserving and developing the classical traditions that provided intellectual foundations for European civilization. But Francis also understood that cultural achievement without military success would never secure French interests against the growing power of the Habsburg dynasty that had come to dominate European politics through a series of fortunate marriages and strategic inheritances. The rivalry between Francis and Charles V, who ruled Spain, Austria, and much of Germany simultaneously, would define European politics for decades while demonstrating how personal conflicts between Renaissance monarchs could escalate into continental warfare that affected millions of lives. The wars between France and the Habsburg Empire revealed how Renaissance monarchy had transformed medieval warfare into something approaching modern conflict, with professional armies, sophisticated fortifications, and systematic strategies that required unprecedented levels of royal resources and administrative capability. The Battle of Pavia in 1525, where Francis was captured by Charles's forces, demonstrated that even the most magnificent Renaissance monarchs remained vulnerable to the fortunes of war that could destroy decades of careful preparation in a single afternoon. Francis's captivity in Madrid provided a fascinating glimpse into how Renaissance monarchs maintained their dignity and authority even under the most humiliating circumstances. Rather than simply accepting defeat and abandoning his political ambitions, Francis used his imprisonment as an opportunity to study his captors' methods while planning future strategies that would eventually enable France to recover from this devastating setback. His conduct during captivity demonstrated the psychological resilience and intellectual flexibility that distinguish successful Renaissance monarchs from their less capable contemporaries. The Treaty of Madrid that secured Francis's release created new precedents for how Renaissance monarchs could use diplomatic negotiation and strategic deception to recover from military disasters that would have destroyed medieval kingdoms. Francis's subsequent repudiation of the treaty's terms revealed how Renaissance diplomacy operated according to principles of realpolitik that prioritized state interests over personal honor in ways that would have scandalized medieval chroniclers, but were becoming standard practice among 16th century rulers. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire as a major player in European politics during this period added another layer of complexity to the diplomatic and military calculations that Renaissance monarchs needed to master. Suleiman the Magnificent, who ruled the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power, represented a form of absolute monarchy that combined Islamic legal principles with Turkish military traditions in ways that created one of the most effective governmental systems of the early modern period. Suleiman's alliance with Francis I against their common Habsburg enemy demonstrated how Renaissance diplomacy could transcend religious and cultural boundaries when political interests aligned, creating precedents for international cooperation that would influence European development long after the specific conflicts that produced them had been resolved. The French-Ottoman alliance scandalized Christian Europe, but it also demonstrated the pragmatic calculations that increasingly dominated Renaissance statecraft. The Siege of Vienna in 1529 marked the high point of Ottoman expansion into Europe, while also revealing the limitations that even the most powerful Renaissance monarchies faced when their ambitions exceeded their logistical capabilities. Suleiman's failure to capture the Habsburg capital wasn't due to lack of military skill or insufficient resources, but rather to the practical impossibilities of maintaining large armies across vast distances without adequate supply lines and communication networks. The Ottoman retreat from Vienna created new opportunities for Habsburg expansion, while also demonstrating how Renaissance warfare had become increasingly dependent on technological innovation and economic resources, rather than simple military courage or tactical brilliance. The cannons and firearms that were transforming 16th century battlefields required sophisticated manufacturing capabilities and systematic training programs that only the most advanced monarchies could provide. In the northern regions of Europe, a different form of Renaissance monarchy was emerging that emphasized religious reform and commercial development rather than military conquest and territorial expansion. Gustav Vasa of Sweden transformed his kingdom from a peripheral dependency of Denmark into an independent Lutheran state that demonstrated how Protestant Reformation could serve the political interests of ambitious monarchs while also advancing genuine religious reform. Gustav's break with Rome and establishment of Swedish Lutheranism created a model for how Renaissance monarchs could use religious reform to strengthen royal authority while reducing their dependence on international ecclesiastical hierarchy. The Swedish Reformation wasn't simply a theological dispute that happened to have political consequences. It was a deliberate strategy for creating new forms of royal legitimacy that could operate independently of papal approval, while mobilizing popular support through appeals to national independence and religious authenticity. The economic policies that Gustav implemented alongside his religious reforms demonstrated how Renaissance monarchy could combine spiritual and material innovation in ways that strengthened both royal authority and national prosperity. The development of Swedish mining, timber, and iron production during his reign created new sources of royal revenue, while also establishing Sweden as a major player in European commerce and international politics. Meanwhile, in the fragmented territories of Germany, the Holy Roman Empire under Charles V was struggling to maintain traditional forms of imperial authority against the centrifugal forces unleashed by the Protestant Reformation and the growing power of territorial princes who were creating their own versions of Renaissance monarchy within their regional domains. The challenge that Charles faced wasn't simply religious or military, but fundamentally political, as the imperial system that had provided stability for centuries proved inadequate to govern territories that were developing in radically different directions. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555, which established the principle that territorial rulers could determine the religious affiliation of their subjects, marked a crucial turning point in the development of European monarchy by recognizing that royal authority could legitimately extend to matters of religious doctrine and spiritual practice that had previously been governed by international ecclesiastical hierarchy. The principle of cuius regio, ius religio didn't simply resolve immediate religious conflicts. It created new foundations for monarchical authority that would influence European development for centuries. The abdication of Charles V in 1556, when he divided his vast territories between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand, demonstrated how even the most powerful Renaissance monarchs recognized the practical limitations of personal rule over territories that were becoming too large and complex for any individual to govern effectively. Charles's decision to retire to a monastery wasn't simply the result of exhaustion or religious conviction. It was a pragmatic recognition that the governmental systems he had inherited were inadequate to meet the challenges that 16th century monarchy faced. The division of the Habsburg dominions created new opportunities for French expansion, while also establishing Spain under Philip II as the dominant European power for the remainder of the 16th century. Philip's inheritance of Spanish territories in Europe and the Americas, combined with his marriage to Mary Tudor and temporary acquisition of the English crown, created the largest empire in human history, while also generating the conflicts and obligations that would eventually exhaust Spanish resources and lead to imperial decline. Philip's reign demonstrated both the magnificent potential and the inherent limitations of Renaissance monarchy at its zenith. His territories stretched from the Netherlands to Peru, his fleets controlled the Atlantic trade routes, and his armies were considered the finest in Europe. Yet his very success created problems that no individual ruler could solve, as the administrative demands of governing such vast territories exceeded the capabilities of any 16th century governmental system. The revolt of the Netherlands against Spanish rule revealed how Renaissance monarchy's emphasis on centralized authority and religious uniformity could generate resistance from populations that had developed their own traditions of local governance and religious practice. The Dutch revolt wasn't simply a rebellion against foreign rule or religious persecution. It was a fundamental challenge to the principles of absolute monarchy that Philip represented, creating precedents for popular resistance and republican government that would influence European development for generations. The Spanish Armada of 1588 marked the climactic moment when Renaissance monarchy's claims to divine sanction and inevitable victory collided with the practical realities of naval warfare, English determination, and meteorological chance. Philip's attempt to conquer England and restore Catholic authority represented the logical culmination of counter-Reformation monarchy. But its failure demonstrated that even the most powerful rulers remained subject to forces beyond their control. The defeat of the Armada didn't simply represent an English victory over Spanish ambitions. It marked the beginning of a new phase in European development, where maritime power and commercial innovation would become more important than territorial control and agricultural production in determining the relative strength of different monarchies. The future would belong to rulers who could adapt to these changing circumstances, rather than those who clung to traditional sources of power and authority. As the 16th century drew toward its close, the Renaissance monarchies that had dominated European politics for nearly 100 years were beginning to show signs of exhaustion and internal contradiction that would eventually require fundamental reforms or lead to revolutionary transformation. The religious wars that had consumed so much energy and resources were creating new forms of political consciousness among populations that were no longer willing to accept royal authority without question or condition. The emergence of new forms of political theory and constitutional thinking during this period created intellectual frameworks for understanding governmental authority that challenged traditional assumptions about divine right and hereditary succession. The works of political theorists like Jean Bodin and Johannes Althusius provided alternative models for organizing political authority that would eventually influence the development of constitutional monarchy and republican government throughout Europe. The witch trials and religious persecution that characterized the later 16th century revealed the dark side of Renaissance monarchies' claims to absolute authority over the spiritual and temporal welfare of royal subjects. The systematic persecution of religious minorities and alleged heretics demonstrated how royal power, when unchecked by institutional constraints or popular consent, could produce horrors that scandalized even contemporaries who were accustomed to political violence as a normal feature of royal government. Yet the same period also witnessed remarkable achievements in art, literature, science, and exploration that demonstrated the creative potential of Renaissance monarchy when it functioned as a patron of human achievement rather than simply an instrument of political control. The works of Shakespeare, Cervantes, and other literary masters were produced within monarchical systems that provided both inspiration and financial support for creative achievement, while also imposing censorship and political constraints that influenced the form and content of artistic expression. The voyages of exploration that opened new continents to European influence were sponsored by Renaissance monarchs, who understood that maritime expansion could provide new sources of wealth and power, while also advancing knowledge and extending Christian civilization to previously unknown regions. The Spanish conquest of Mexico and Peru, the Portuguese exploration of Africa and Asia, and the English and French ventures into North America created global empires that transformed European monarchy from regional to worldwide phenomena. But these same imperial expansion also created new challenges and obligations that would test the adaptive capabilities of European monarchical systems for centuries to come. The administration of colonial territories, the integration of non-European populations, and the management of transcontinental commerce required governmental innovations that stretched traditional monarchical institutions beyond their original design parameters. As we continue our gentle journey through the corridors of royal history, we approach the threshold of an era when monarchy would face its greatest challenges and achieve its most spectacular successes, often simultaneously. The 17th century would witness the emergence of absolute monarchy as a systematic theory of government, while also producing the revolutions and constitutional limitations that would eventually transform royal authority into the constitutional systems that govern democratic nations today. The Renaissance monarchs, whose reigns we have explored together tonight, established the foundations for these later developments through their experiments in royal authority, their innovations in governmental administration, and their responses to the religious, economic, and intellectual challenges that defined their age. Their successes and failures created precedents and institutions that would influence European development long after their dynasties had vanished from the stage of history. In the flickering candlelight of these ancient halls, we can glimpse the eternal human struggle to create effective government while preserving individual liberty, to maintain political stability while adapting to changing circumstances, and to exercise authority responsibly while pursuing the ambitions that make life meaningful. The Renaissance monarchs whose stories have accompanied us through this portion of our journey remind us that political leadership requires not just power and intelligence, but also the wisdom to understand the limitations of human authority and the courage to accept responsibility for consequences that extend far beyond individual intention or control. The 17th century opened like a vast theatre where the greatest drama of monarchy would unfold, bringing with it kings who would claim dominion over the very souls of their subjects, while queens wielded power that medieval rulers could never have conceived. This was the age when royal authority would crystallize into its most absolute form, creating palaces that served as temples to monarchical power, while simultaneously generating the intellectual and political forces that would eventually challenge the divine right of kings itself. In the gilded halls of Versailles, a young Louis XIV was learning lessons about kingship that would transform not only France, but the entire concept of what it meant to rule by divine appointment. The boy who would become the Sun King understood instinctively that 17th century monarchy required more than inherited authority or military success. It demanded the creation of an entire cosmology of power, where every gesture, every ceremony, every architectural detail served to reinforce the sacred nature of royal authority, while binding the nobility to the crown through bonds of dependence and awe. Louis's transformation of his father's modest hunting lodge into the most magnificent palace in European history wasn't simply an expression of personal vanity or architectural ambition. It was a deliberate political strategy designed to solve the fundamental problem that had plagued French monarchy for centuries. How could kings maintain absolute authority over nobles who possessed their own territories, armies, and sources of wealth that might challenge royal supremacy? The answer lay in creating a system where proximity to the monarch became more valuable than independent power, where the greatest nobles competed for the privilege of attending royal ceremonies rather than plotting rebellion in their provincial strongholds. The elaborate court ceremonial that Louis developed at Versailles transformed the most basic human activities into sacred rituals that reinforced royal divinity, while providing endless opportunities for nobles to demonstrate their loyalty and compete for royal favour. The morning levée, where carefully selected courtiers were permitted to witness the king's awakening and dressing, wasn't simply a bizarre example of royal egotism. It was a sophisticated mechanism for controlling aristocratic ambition by making access to the royal presence the ultimate source of political influence and social status. Every aspect of life at Versailles was carefully choreographed to reinforce the message that the king was not merely a political leader, but a quasi-divine figure whose very existence sanctified the social order and guaranteed the stability of the kingdom. The Hall of Mirrors, where Louis received foreign ambassadors, surrounded by images of his own glory, reflected infinitely in polished glass, created a visual metaphor for royal authority that extended throughout the universe while remaining centered on the person of the monarch. But Louis's innovations in royal ceremonial were matched by equally revolutionary developments in governmental administration that created the most effective centralized state in European history. The system of intendants that he perfected allowed royal authority to penetrate into every corner of the kingdom through professional administrators, who owed their positions entirely to royal appointment and could be removed at royal pleasure. These officials weren't nobles exercising hereditary rights or clergy representing ecclesiastical authority. They were bureaucrats whose power derived solely from their ability to implement royal policy effectively while reporting back to Versailles about local conditions and potential sources of resistance. The military innovations that Louis sponsored created the largest and most professional army in European history, with standardized uniforms, systematic training, and centralized command structures that made French forces the envy and terror of neighboring kingdoms. But more importantly, this military machine was designed to serve royal policy rather than feudal obligation or mercenary contract, creating an instrument of state power that could be deployed according to rational strategic calculation, rather than the personal whims of individual commanders or the traditional obligations of feudal service. The economic policies that supported this unprecedented expansion of royal authority required innovations in taxation, manufacturing, and commercial regulation that transformed France from a collection of semi-autonomous provinces into an integrated national economy serving royal interests. Jean-Baptiste Colbert's mercantilist reforms weren't simply technical adjustments to fiscal policy. They represented a fundamental reconceptualization of the relationship between royal authority and economic activity, establishing the principle that commercial and industrial development should serve state power rather than private profit or local convenience. The cultural achievements of Louis's reign demonstrated how absolute monarchy could serve as a patron of human achievement while also using artistic and intellectual production to reinforce political authority. The works of Molière, Racine, and Corneille weren't simply entertainment for royal amusement. They were expressions of a distinctively French cultural identity that celebrated royal authority while exploring the moral and philosophical questions that absolute monarchy raised about the nature of power, justice, and human dignity. But the very success of Louis's innovations in absolute monarchy created problems that would eventually undermine the system he had worked so carefully to construct. The costs of maintaining Versailles, supporting the largest army in Europe, and pursuing an aggressive foreign policy that aimed at establishing French hegemony throughout the continent required levels of taxation and economic regulation that strained the resources of even the wealthiest European kingdom. The wars that Louis fought to extend French territory and influence generated enormous expenses, while also creating coalitions of enemies who were determined to prevent French domination of European politics. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685, which ended religious toleration for French Protestants and forced hundreds of thousands of skilled artisans and merchants into exile, demonstrated how absolute monarchy's claims to control the spiritual lives of royal subjects could produce economic and social consequences that weakened the very foundations of royal power. Louis's decision to eliminate religious diversity from his kingdom wasn't simply an expression of personal religious conviction or political intolerance. It represented the logical culmination of absolute monarchy's claim to total authority over every aspect of subjects' lives, including their relationship with God. The exodus of Huguenot refugees from France enriched the kingdoms that welcomed them while depriving France of entrepreneurial talent and commercial expertise that had contributed significantly to French economic development. The irony was that Louis's pursuit of absolute religious uniformity weakened French power relative to more tolerant kingdoms that were willing to accept religious diversity in exchange for economic and military advantages that skilled immigrants could provide. Meanwhile, across the Channel, England was conducting its own experiment with absolute monarchy under the Stuart dynasty, but with results that would prove far different from the French experience. Charles I's attempts to rule without parliament and impose religious uniformity on his diverse kingdoms generated resistance that would ultimately lead to civil war, regicide, and the establishment of republican government under Oliver Cromwell. The English Civil War represented the first systematic challenge to divine right monarchy in European history, creating precedents for popular resistance and constitutional limitation that would influence political development throughout the continent. The execution of Charles I in 1649 sent shockwaves throughout European courts, demonstrating that even kings who claimed divine sanction for their authority could be held accountable to their subjects for their policies and conduct. The ceremony of royal execution wasn't simply a political act or expression of popular anger. It was a deliberate rejection of the theological and philosophical foundations of absolute monarchy, establishing the principle that royal authority derived from popular consent rather than divine appointment, and could be withdrawn when monarchs failed to serve the interests of those they governed. The Commonwealth period under Cromwell demonstrated that effective government didn't require royal authority, but it also revealed the practical difficulties of maintaining political stability without the traditional sources of legitimacy that monarchy provided. Cromwell's struggle to establish lasting institutions that could govern England without a king illustrated the challenges that republican government faced in societies where political authority had been organized around monarchical principles for centuries. The restoration of the monarchy under Charles II in 1660 represented not simply a return to traditional royal authority, but the beginning of a new form of constitutional monarchy that acknowledged limitations on royal power while preserving the ceremonial and symbolic functions that made monarchy politically useful. Charles II's reign demonstrated how intelligent monarchs could adapt to changed circumstances by accepting restrictions on their authority in exchange for security and stability that absolute claims to divine right could no longer provide. The Glorious Revolution of 1688, which replaced the Catholic James II with the Protestant William III and Mary II, established definitively that English monarchs ruled subject to parliamentary consent and constitutional limitation, rather than divine right and absolute authority. The political settlement that emerged from this bloodless revolution created a model of limited monarchy that would eventually influence constitutional development throughout Europe and the Americas. But the English example remained exceptional during the late 17th century. As most European monarchies continued to develop along absolutist lines that emphasized royal authority over popular consent and divine sanction over constitutional limitation, the Habsburg monarchy under Leopold I demonstrated how traditional imperial institutions could be adapted to support centralized royal authority while maintaining the complex federal relationships that held the Austrian dominions together. Leopold's success in defending Vienna against Ottoman siege in 1683 and subsequently driving Turkish forces out of Hungary established Austrian Habsburg power as a major force in European politics, while also demonstrating how religious war could serve the political interests of Christian monarchs. The emergence of Brandenburg Prussia under the Great Elector. Frederick William represented another model of 17th century state building that emphasized military efficiency and administrative competence over cultural magnificence or religious authority. The Prussian system that emerged during this period created one of the most effective military machines in European history, while also developing administrative institutions that could extract maximum resources from limited territorial base through systematic organization and professional competence. Frederick William's innovations in military organization and state finance demonstrated how smaller kingdoms could compete with larger powers through superior efficiency and strategic focus, rather than trying to match their resources or territorial extent. The Prussian model would eventually influence military and administrative development throughout Europe, while also providing an alternative to the French example of absolute monarchy based on cultural splendor and ceremonial magnificence. In the northern regions of Europe, Sweden under Charles XII was pursuing its own version of absolute monarchy based on military conquest and territorial expansion that would briefly establish Swedish dominance throughout the Baltic region, before collapsing under the weight of its own ambitions. Charles's victories against Russian, Polish, and Danish forces demonstrated the continued importance of personal military leadership in 17th century warfare, while also revealing the limitations that even the most successful military monarchs faced when their ambitions exceeded their resources. The Great Northern War that consumed the later years of Charles's reign illustrated how 17th century warfare had evolved into conflicts of attrition that tested the administrative and economic capabilities of entire kingdoms, rather than simply the tactical skills of individual commanders or the courage of professional armies. The eventual Swedish defeat at Poltava in 1709 marked the beginning of Russian emergence as a major European power, while also demonstrating the practical limitations of military monarchy when faced with enemies who possessed superior resources and more effective governmental systems. The reign of Peter the Great of Russia represented perhaps the most dramatic example of how 17th and early 18th century monarchs could transform their kingdoms through systematic reform and cultural revolution imposed from above through absolute royal authority. Peter's determination to modernize Russia according to Western European models required not just administrative and military reforms, but fundamental changes in Russian culture, religion, and social organization that challenged centuries of traditional practice. Peter's creation of St. Petersburg as a new capital, designed according to European architectural principles, demonstrated how absolute monarchs could literally reshape the physical environment to reflect their vision of modern royal authority. The new city wasn't simply a more convenient location for government administration. It was a symbol of Peter's determination to transform Russia from a backward Orthodox kingdom into a major European power capable of competing with the most advanced monarchies of the age. The table of ranks that Peter established created a new form of nobility based on state service rather than hereditary privilege, demonstrating how absolute monarchs could use their authority to restructure social hierarchies in ways that served royal interests, while also providing opportunities for talented individuals to advance through merit rather than birth. The Petrine reforms represented one of the most successful examples of monarchical modernization in European history, but they also revealed the enormous costs in human suffering and cultural disruption that such transformation required. The emergence of the Ottoman Empire as a major factor in European politics during this period continued to provide an alternative model of absolute monarchy based on Islamic legal principles and Turkish administrative traditions that demonstrated the effectiveness of centralized authority while operating according to fundamentally different cultural and religious assumptions than Christian European kingdoms. The Ottoman system under sultans like Mehmed IV and Mustafa II created governmental institutions that were simultaneously more centralized and more flexible than most European monarchies, allowing for effective administration of diverse populations while maintaining religious and cultural autonomy for non-Muslim subjects. The gradual Ottoman decline during the late 17th century wasn't due to inherent weaknesses in Islamic governmental systems, but rather to the same problems of overextension and resource limitation that affected all early modern empires when their territorial ambitions exceeded their administrative and military capabilities. The Ottoman retreat from European territories after the failure at Vienna created opportunities for Austrian and Russian expansion, while also demonstrating the cyclical nature of imperial power that characterized early modern international politics. The scientific revolution that transformed European intellectual life during the 17th century created new challenges and opportunities for absolute monarchy, as traditional sources of authority based on religious doctrine and classical precedent came under systematic questioning by natural philosophers who insisted that knowledge should be based on empirical observation rather than received wisdom. The works of scientists like Galileo, Newton, and Descartes didn't simply advance human understanding of natural phenomena. They created new methods of inquiry and standards of evidence that could potentially be applied to political and social questions in ways that challenged traditional justifications for royal authority. The academies of science that absolute monarchs established in their capitals served multiple purposes in the complex relationship between royal power and intellectual innovation. These institutions provided royal patronage for scientific research, while also demonstrating monarchical commitment to advancing human knowledge and supporting practical applications that could strengthen royal government. But they also created communities of learned individuals whose expertise and international connections provided them with sources of authority and influence that operated independently of royal control. The religious conflicts that continued to divide European Christianity throughout the 17th century provided both opportunities and constraints for absolute monarchs who needed to balance the competing demands of religious authenticity, political necessity, and international diplomacy. The 30 Years' War that devastated Central Europe from 1618 to 1648 demonstrated how religious differences could generate conflicts that transcended traditional political boundaries, while also revealing the practical limitations of using military force to resolve theological disputes. The Peace of Westphalia that ended the 30 Years' War established new principles of international relations that emphasized state sovereignty and territorial integrity over religious unity or imperial authority, creating a system of competing nation-states that would dominate European politics for centuries. The Westphalian settlement represented a triumph for the principle of absolute monarchy within defined territorial boundaries, while also acknowledging that no single monarch could legitimately claim universal authority over other sovereign rulers. The economic development that characterized the 17th century created new sources of wealth and power that absolute monarchs needed to control or accommodate if they wanted to maintain their authority over increasingly complex societies. The growth of international trade, colonial expansion, and manufacturing created merchant classes whose economic importance gave them political influence that traditional noble hierarchies found difficult to contain or direct. The Dutch Republic during its golden age demonstrated how commercial prosperity and cultural achievement could flourish under republican institutions that distributed political authority among multiple stakeholders rather than concentrating it in a single monarch. The Dutch example provided an alternative model of political organization that challenged absolute monarchy's claims to be the most effective form of government, while also demonstrating how religious toleration and economic freedom could serve practical political purposes. The colonial empires that European monarchs established in the Americas, Africa, and Asia during this period created new forms of royal authority that operated according to different principles than domestic governance, while also generating wealth and resources that could support expanded governmental activities in European territories. The administration of colonial territories required innovations in law, military organization, and economic regulation that tested the adaptive capabilities of European monarchical systems, while also creating new forms of cultural contact and conflict that would influence European development for centuries. The intellectual ferment that characterized the late 17th century was beginning to generate new theories of political authority and governmental organization that would eventually challenge the theological and philosophical foundations of absolute monarchy. The works of political theorists like John Locke and Baruch Spinoza created alternative frameworks for understanding the relationship between rulers and subjects that emphasized natural rights and popular consent rather than divine appointment and hereditary succession. As the 17th century drew toward its close, the age of absolute monarchy was reaching both its zenith and the beginning of its eventual transformation into constitutional and limited forms of royal authority. The monarchical systems that had been perfected during this period would continue to dominate European politics for generations, but they would also face increasing challenges from intellectual, economic, and social forces that their very success had helped to create. The twilight years of Louis XIV's reign revealed the costs and contradictions of absolute monarchy in their starkest form, as the most magnificent court in European history struggled with financial crisis, military defeat, and social tensions that even the most sophisticated royal propaganda could not entirely conceal. The famines and fiscal problems that plagued France during the early 18th century demonstrated that absolute royal authority, however impressive in its ceremonial manifestations, remained subject to practical limitations that no amount of divine sanction could overcome. In the quiet halls where we have wandered together tonight, we can sense the approaching transformation that would carry absolute monarchy into new forms of royal authority better adapted to the changing realities of European society and international politics. The monarchs whose reigns we have explored established precedents and institutions that would influence political development long after their particular systems had been modified or replaced by more flexible arrangements. The 17th century had witnessed monarchy at both its most magnificent and most vulnerable, creating governmental systems of unprecedented sophistication, while also generating the intellectual and political forces that would eventually require fundamental reforms in how royal authority was understood and exercised. As we continue our gentle journey through the corridors of royal history, we approach an age when monarchs would need to master new forms of statecraft, while preserving the essential functions that had made monarchy politically useful for over a millennium of European development. The 18th century dawned with a deceptive tranquility across the courts of Europe, like morning mist settling over battlefields where the ghosts of absolute monarchy still walked among the living. Yet beneath this seeming calm, new currents were stirring that would transform the very foundations upon which royal authority had rested for generations. This was to be the age of enlightened despotism, where monarchs would attempt to reconcile the demands of reason with the traditions of divine kingship, often with consequences they could never have anticipated. In the amber-lit chambers of Sanssouci, Frederick the Great of Prussia was crafting a new model of royal leadership that combined philosophical sophistication with ruthless political calculation. The king who corresponded with Voltaire and composed musical works for his own flute was the same monarch who would dismember Poland and establish Prussian military dominance through campaigns of methodical brutality. Frederick understood something that many of his contemporaries missed about the evolving nature of 18th century monarchy. Success no longer depended solely on inherited legitimacy or religious sanction, but on the ability to master new forms of knowledge while adapting traditional institutions to serve contemporary purposes. Frederick's Prussia represented a fascinating synthesis of Enlightenment ideals and absolute power, where rational administration and military efficiency created a state machine of unprecedented effectiveness. His legal reforms, which established uniform codes of justice throughout his territories, weren't simply expressions of philosophical commitment to equality before the law. They were practical instruments for strengthening royal authority by reducing the power of local nobles and traditional jurisdictions that had previously limited central control. The economic policies that Frederick implemented demonstrated how enlightened monarchs could use new theories of political economy to increase state revenues while claiming to serve the general welfare of their subjects. His encouragement of agricultural improvement, manufacturing development, and religious toleration weren't purely altruistic gestures. They were calculated strategies for maximizing the human and material resources available to royal government, while creating new sources of political support among populations that had previously been excluded from meaningful participation in public affairs. Meanwhile, in the glittering salons of Versailles, Louis XV was discovering that inherited magnificence was insufficient to maintain royal authority in an age when subjects increasingly demanded practical justifications for monarchical privilege. The king who had inherited the most splendid court in European history found himself governing a kingdom where traditional sources of legitimacy were being questioned by philosophers, criticized by lawyers, and undermined by fiscal crisis that no amount of ceremonial grandeur could disguise. The intellectual revolution that was transforming European culture during this period created unprecedented challenges for monarchs who had traditionally relied on religious doctrine and classical precedent to justify their authority. The works of Montesquieu, Rousseau, and the encyclopédistes didn't simply advance human knowledge about natural and social phenomena. They created new standards for evaluating governmental institutions that emphasized utility and consent rather than tradition and divine sanction as the proper foundations for political authority. The salons where these new ideas were discussed and refined operated according to principles that implicitly challenged monarchical assumptions about the proper relationship between rulers and subjects. In these elegant drawing rooms, aristocratic women like Madame de Pompadour and Madame Geoffrin exercised forms of intellectual and cultural authority that derived from their ability to facilitate conversation and shape opinion, rather than from inherited rank or official position. The influence these women wielded demonstrated how 18th century society was creating new forms of power that operated independently of traditional hierarchies, while potentially challenging royal control over cultural and intellectual life. The emergence of public opinion as a political force during this period represented perhaps the most significant transformation in the relationship between monarchs and their subjects since the development of feudalism itself. For the first time in European history, rulers needed to consider how their policies would be perceived and discussed by literate populations who possessed independent sources of information and alternative frameworks for evaluating governmental performance. The growth of newspapers, pamphlets, and published criticism created new forms of political communication that monarchs could influence but not entirely control. Kings, who had once been able to manage their reputations through court chroniclers and official propaganda, now faced the challenge of responding to criticism that could spread throughout their kingdoms faster than royal censorship could suppress it. This transformation required new skills in public relations and political communication that few 18th century monarchs possessed or even understood they needed. Across the Atlantic, the American colonies were beginning to develop their own ideas about legitimate government that would eventually challenge not just British imperial authority, but the entire European tradition of monarchical rule. The colonial assemblies that had emerged throughout British America created precedents for representative government that operated according to principles quite different from those that governed European political systems. When conflicts arose between colonial interests and imperial policy, American leaders increasingly turned to theories of natural rights and popular sovereignty that provided intellectual justification for resistance to royal authority. The 7 Years' War, which raged across multiple continents from 1756 to 1763, demonstrated how 18th century conflicts had evolved beyond the dynastic disputes and territorial ambitions that had characterized earlier European warfare. This was truly the first global war, where battles in India and North America determined the balance of power in European capitals, while colonial resources provided the financial foundation for military campaigns that spanned oceans and continents. Frederick's survival during this massive conflict, when Prussia faced a coalition that included France, Austria, Russia, and most of the German states, revealed both the strengths and limitations of enlightened despotism when subjected to existential pressure. His ability to maintain Prussian independence against overwhelming odds wasn't due simply to military genius or diplomatic skill, though he possessed both in abundance. It reflected the systematic reforms he had implemented during peacetime that created administrative and military institutions capable of extraordinary performance under extreme stress. But the human cost of Frederick's success was enormous, with Prussian casualties reaching levels that would have destroyed less systematically organized kingdoms, while the devastation inflicted on civilian populations demonstrated how enlightened principles could coexist with unprecedented brutality when state survival was at stake. The contradiction between Frederick's philosophical sophistication and his military ruthlessness illustrated the fundamental tensions within enlightened despotism that would eventually require resolution through more systematic reforms or revolutionary transformation. The British victory in the 7 Years' War established English-speaking peoples as the dominant global power, while also creating the financial pressures that would eventually lead to the American Revolution. The costs of defending and administering the expanded empire that Britain acquired through this conflict required new approaches to taxation and imperial governance that challenged traditional relationships between the mother country and colonial territories. The attempts by successive British governments to extract revenue from American colonies through measures like the Stamp Act and Tea Act generated resistance based on principles of representation and consent that had deep roots in English constitutional tradition, but radical implications when applied to imperial relationships. The American colonists, who proclaimed that taxation without representation was tyranny, weren't simply expressing narrow self-interest. They were articulating a theory of legitimate government that challenged monarchical authority throughout the Atlantic world. In France, the financial crisis generated by participation in the 7 Years' War and subsequent American Revolutionary War created pressures for governmental reform that would eventually overwhelm the monarchy itself. Louis XVI, who inherited these mounting problems when he ascended the throne in 1774, was a well-intentioned monarch who understood the need for change, but lacked the political skills necessary to implement reforms without triggering the revolutionary forces that would ultimately destroy the ancient regime. The calling of the Estates General in 1789, the first such assembly in over a century and a half, represented Louis XVI's attempt to address fiscal crisis through traditional methods of royal consultation with his subjects. But the representatives who gathered at Versailles brought with them new ideas about popular sovereignty and constitutional government that transformed what was intended to be a royal request for financial assistance into a fundamental challenge to monarchical authority itself. The transformation of the Third Estate into the National Assembly marked the beginning of the French Revolution and the end of absolute monarchy as a viable form of government in Western Europe. The revolutionaries who took the tennis court oath weren't simply rebelling against particular royal policies or demanding specific reforms. They were asserting the principle that legitimate authority derived from popular will rather than divine appointment, creating precedents that would influence political development throughout the modern world. Meanwhile, in the vast expanses of Russia, Catherine II was conducting her own experiment in enlightened despotism that demonstrated how philosophical principles could be adapted to serve the expansion of imperial power while modernizing governmental institutions. Catherine's legal reforms, educational initiatives, and territorial conquests created a version of enlightened monarchy that was simultaneously more systematic and more ruthless than anything attempted in Western Europe. Catherine's instruction, which attempted to codify Enlightenment principles for Russian legal reform, represented one of the most ambitious efforts to apply philosophical theory to practical governance in 18th century Europe. But the document also revealed the contradictions inherent in trying to reconcile theories based on natural equality with political systems that depended on serfdom and aristocratic privilege for their continued existence. The Pugachev Rebellion, which challenged Catherine's authority throughout southeastern Russia, demonstrated how enlightened reforms could generate expectations among subject populations that monarchical systems were structurally incapable of satisfying. The peasant uprising led by Emelian Pugachev wasn't simply a traditional jacquerie protesting specific grievances. It was a systematic challenge to the social foundations of imperial authority that required military suppression on a scale that revealed the ultimate dependence of enlightened despotism on force rather than consent. The partitions of Poland that Catherine orchestrated in cooperation with Prussia and Austria represented enlightened despotism's approach to international relations, where rational calculation of state interests took precedence over traditional moral constraints or legal obligations. The systematic destruction of Polish independence demonstrated how 18th century monarchs could apply Enlightenment principles of efficiency and utility to territorial expansion while ignoring Enlightenment theories about natural rights and popular sovereignty when they conflicted with imperial ambitions. In the German states, a new generation of rulers was experimenting with different approaches to enlightened reform that emphasized gradual modernization rather than revolutionary transformation. Monarchs like Joseph II of Austria and Karl Frederick of Baden attempted to implement systematic reforms in administration, law, and social organization while preserving monarchical authority through careful attention to timing and political management. Joseph II's reforms represented perhaps the most comprehensive attempt to apply Enlightenment principles to traditional monarchical government, with initiatives that addressed everything from religious toleration and peasant emancipation to administrative reorganization and legal codification. But Joseph's experience also demonstrated the practical difficulties of implementing rational reforms in societies where traditional institutions and cultural practices provided stability and identity for populations that weren't necessarily prepared for rapid change. The resistance that Joseph encountered from nobles, clergy, and peasants who saw his reforms as threats to their established rights and customary practices revealed how enlightened despotism could generate opposition from the very groups it claimed to benefit. The revolts in Belgium and Hungary that forced Joseph to modify or abandon many of his initiatives illustrated the continuing importance of traditional legitimacy and cultural continuity, even in an age that celebrated reason and progress as the foundations for good government. The smaller German states provided laboratories for experimenting with different approaches to enlightened reform that could be implemented more systematically than in larger territories where entrenched interests and traditional institutions created greater resistance to change. Rulers like Charles Augustus of Weimar demonstrated how minor princes could achieve disproportionate cultural and intellectual influence through patronage of arts and letters, while implementing gradual reforms that modernize their territories without generating revolutionary upheaval. The emergence of German cultural nationalism during this period created new forms of identity and loyalty that would eventually challenge both the fragmented political structure of the Holy Roman Empire and the universal claims of Enlightenment rationalism. The works of writers like Herder and Goethe celebrated distinctive German cultural achievements while also articulating theories of national development that emphasized historical continuity and cultural authenticity rather than abstract rational principles as the proper foundations for political organization. In Spain, the Bourbon reforms implemented by Charles III represented another version of enlightened despotism, adapted to the specific challenges of governing a global empire that stretched from Europe to the Americas and the Philippines. The administrative reorganization, economic development, and military modernization that Charles sponsored demonstrated how 18th century monarchs could use Enlightenment principles to strengthen imperial authority while adapting to changing international circumstances. But the Spanish reforms also generated resistance from colonial populations who saw centralization and increased taxation as threats to traditional autonomy and customary privileges. The revolts in Peru and New Granada that challenged Spanish authority during this period revealed how enlightened reforms could have revolutionary implications when applied to colonial territories where different ethnic groups possessed competing claims to legitimate authority. The expulsion of the Jesuits from Spanish territories in 1767 illustrated how enlightened monarchs could use anti-clerical policies to strengthen royal authority while also demonstrating the international ramifications of domestic reforms in an age when religious orders, commercial networks, and intellectual communities operated across political boundaries. The emergence of the United States as an independent republic created an entirely new model of political organization that challenged European assumptions about the necessity of monarchical government, while also providing practical demonstration that Enlightenment theories could be successfully implemented through constitutional rather than despotic means. The American experiment in republican government represented not just a successful rebellion against British imperial authority, but a systematic attempt to create political institutions based on popular sovereignty, separation of powers, and constitutional limitation of governmental authority. The influence of American political innovations on European intellectual life was immediate and profound, providing concrete evidence that alternative forms of government could function effectively, while also inspiring political reformers throughout the Atlantic world who sought to apply similar principles to their own circumstances. The American Revolution demonstrated that Enlightenment theories weren't simply philosophical abstractions, but practical guides for creating more effective and legitimate forms of governmental authority. As the 18th century moved toward its revolutionary climax, the experiments in enlightened despotism that had characterized the middle decades were revealing their fundamental contradictions and limitations. Monarchs who claimed to rule according to rational principles while maintaining absolute authority found themselves caught between rising expectations for reform and traditional resistance to change that their own policies had often intensified. The financial crises, social tensions, and intellectual ferment that marked the final decades of the century created conditions that would test every assumption about royal authority while generating new forms of political consciousness that monarchical institutions were poorly equipped to contain or channel. The age of enlightened despotism had created more problems than it had solved, raising questions about legitimate government that could no longer be answered through traditional appeals to divine right or inherited authority. In the candlelit chambers where we have wandered together through these transformative decades, we can sense the approaching storm that would sweep away much of the old order while creating new possibilities for human freedom and political participation. The monarchs whose experiments we have observed established precedents and generated ideas that would influence political development long after their particular systems had been overthrown or fundamentally transformed by revolutionary forces they had inadvertently helped to create. The twilight of the 18th century brought with it the recognition that monarchy, however enlightened or reformed, could no longer serve as the sole foundation for legitimate government in societies where new forms of knowledge, economic organization, and cultural identity were creating unprecedented demands for political participation and constitutional limitation of governmental authority. The future would belong to political systems that could reconcile effective governance with popular sovereignty, individual rights with collective welfare, and national identity with universal principles of human dignity and freedom. The revolutionary tempest that swept across Europe in the final decades of the 18th century left no corner of the continent untouched, transforming ancient kingdoms and creating new forms of political possibility that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. As the 19th century dawned over a landscape scarred by war and renewal, monarchy itself was being reborn in forms that bore little resemblance to the divine right absolutism that had dominated European politics for centuries. In the smoke-filled councils of post-revolutionary France, Napoleon Bonaparte was forging a new synthesis of democratic legitimacy and imperial authority that would challenge every assumption about how royal power could function in the modern world. The young general, who had risen from obscurity through merit rather than birth, understood instinctively that 19th century monarchy required entirely different foundations than its predecessors. Divine right and inherited privilege were no longer sufficient to command obedience from populations that had tasted the intoxicating possibilities of popular sovereignty and national self-determination. Napoleon's transformation from first consul to emperor represented more than simply another ambitious general seizing power through military coup. It marked the emergence of a new form of monarchical authority based on personal charisma, administrative competence, and national glory, rather than traditional dynastic legitimacy. When Napoleon placed the imperial crown upon his own head in Notre Dame Cathedral, he wasn't simply crowning himself emperor. He was demonstrating that royal authority in the modern age would belong to those capable of earning it, rather than those fortunate enough to inherit it. The Code Napoleon that emerged from his legal reforms created a framework for civil law that would influence legal development throughout Europe and beyond, demonstrating how modern monarchs could achieve lasting influence through institutional innovation rather than military conquest alone. The systematic organization of legal principles according to rational categories reflected Enlightenment influence, while also serving practical needs of governing diverse populations within rapidly expanding imperial boundaries. But Napoleon's greatest innovation was his understanding of how nationalist sentiment could be channeled to support imperial authority rather than challenging it. The Grande Armée that carried French power from Madrid to Moscow wasn't simply a professional military force serving dynastic interests. It was an expression of French national identity that made every soldier a stakeholder in imperial success, while spreading revolutionary ideals throughout Europe in the baggage trains of conquering armies. The impact of Napoleonic warfare on European monarchy extended far beyond immediate military victories and territorial redistributions. The systematic destruction of the Holy Roman Empire in 1806 ended a 1,000-year tradition of universal imperial authority, while creating new opportunities for German political development that would eventually produce unified national monarchy under Prussian leadership. The continental system that Napoleon imposed on European commerce demonstrated how modern imperial power could operate through economic rather than purely military means, creating precedents for later forms of economic nationalism and imperial control. The resistance that Napoleon encountered throughout Europe revealed how his revolutionary innovations had inadvertently strengthened the very forces that would eventually destroy his empire. The Spanish guerrilla warfare that consumed French resources and manpower for years demonstrated how nationalist sentiment could be turned against foreign occupation, regardless of the ideological benefits that conquest might theoretically provide. The Russian campaign of 1812 illustrated the continuing importance of geography and logistics. In an age when military technology had transformed the tactical possibilities of warfare without eliminating its fundamental strategic constraints. Meanwhile, in the German states, the humiliation of military defeat and foreign occupation was generating new forms of cultural and political consciousness that would eventually challenge both Napoleonic hegemony and traditional particularist loyalties. The reforms implemented by Prussian ministers like Stein and Hardenberg weren't simply administrative adjustments designed to improve governmental efficiency. They represented systematic attempts to mobilize popular energy for national resistance, while modernizing political institutions that had proven inadequate to contemporary challenges. As our thousand-year journey through the halls of royal power draws to its gentle close, we find ourselves standing at the threshold where medieval monarchy began its transformation into the modern world. From Clovis forging the first synthesis of Germanic warrior culture and Christian authority, through the magnificent courts of Renaissance princes, to the revolutionary upheavals that would reshape the very foundations of political legitimacy, we have witnessed how human ambition and institutional innovation dance together across the centuries to create the complex tapestry of European civilization. These monarchs, neither perfect heroes nor complete villains, remind us that history unfolds through countless individual choices made by people who could never fully grasp the consequences of their actions. In the flickering candlelight of memory, their stories become our inheritance, carrying us peacefully towards sleep with dreams filled with the eternal human struggle to balance power with justice, tradition with progress, and the weight of crowns with the freedom that makes life itself worth living.